Okay, so now we'll go into our afternoon keynote. And I'd like to introduce Luchi Megwa as the moderator for this session. Luchi Megwa is a second-year MBA student from Nigeria who graduated with a degree in public policy from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. Prior to HBS, Luchi worked in investment banking and private equity investing for Goldman Sachs and Company in the New York office, focused on the consumer and retail and healthcare industries. Luchi spent this past summer with Carlyle's Africa-focused private equity investment team based in Lagos. Please join me in welcoming Luchi Megwa.
Thank you very much. So before we have the fireside conversation, I invite Mr. Roosevelt Ogbonna from Access Bank to make his presentation.
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me? Excellent. I'm very pleased to be here. It's my first, and I hope won't be the last, of an invitation to join the Africa Business Conference. This is the 22nd African Business Conference, and I think this year is themed Africa 2020, and it's around creating a clear vision for that future prosperity that Africa desires. I'm going to spend the next few minutes speaking about what I think are the critical ingredients to support Africa in attaining that vision that it has for itself. I see a lot of people staring at me. I have no checks to offer. All the checks have been given, so don't expect any check given at this point. My name is Roosevelt Chinaka Michael and Kemakolam Ogbonna. I think what is tricky about this name is that you could hear a bit of Christian, African, English, but truly that's who I am. And these names mean something to me because each one on his own represents a piece of me. And I hold it jealously and guard it. No different from Kinte Kunte in Roots. If you pronounce my name wrongly, we might have a fight. But I think what's interesting about names is that they speak to a heritage. They tell where the individual is from. And when I mention my name, if you're Nigerian, you can figure out, yeah, pretty much he's from the East. But I think more importantly is that it tells about the mystery of a future. So anyone who's watched The Lion King will remember how Simba was presented and his proud father Mufasa was there looking on. And the reality is that that mystery is what Africa represents today. Everyone says there's so much potential. It's like when a child is born. Everyone trunks to the house and you want to see the child's face because you're hoping that written on that face you could tell who the child looks like. What would he be in the future? And I think Africa, in some sense, represents that mystery today. There's so much going on. But what would Africa be in the future? And I think that's where I'd like to focus my conversation today. And I'll do that in a very interesting way. I think my names in themselves are prophetic in some sense, and will give some insight into how my vision of Africa in the future is. My first name is Roosevelt, as I said. And Roosevelt is a bastardized Dutch name, which in real sense is pronounced Rosenfeld. Are there any Dutch people here before I murder the name? Rosenfeld means field of roses. It's not one rose. It's a field of roses. It speaks to abundance. It speaks to plentiness. And Africa is blessed with a lot of abundance, loads of riches, from the gold in Ghana and places like South Africa, diamonds in Sierra Leone and Liberia, oil in Nigeria, tantalite in Egypt, copper in Zambia. We're fully blessed. But we're not a wealthy continent. Because that's all we have, natural resources. And we've not changed the conversation beyond how much oil or copper or tantalite or cobalt we have to how much wealth we are creating for our people. That conversation needs to change for Africa to move forward. Now, to be able to achieve that, Africa is blessed in human resources. 1.6 billion people. 65% of them are considered youths. Average population growth about 3% in many African nations. There's a projection that 65% of arable land will be in Africa by 2050. So we have land. We also have people. And what we lack is capital. The capital formation in Africa is very weak. Infrastructure does not exist. The World Bank estimates that in Nigeria alone, about $18 billion has to be, $88 billion has to be spent annually for the next 14 years for Nigeria to bridge the infrastructure gap that we have today. That's a lot of money. But in there is a lot of potential because the government can't do it alone. We have to invest in technology, roads, schools, hospitals. Because we need not just people, not just land, not just abundance in resources. We need the right infrastructure to pool all of this together to make it work. The conversation has to be about wealth creation, not celebrating the abundance of our natural wealth, because that we did nothing to attain. It's God-given. The work that you and I and all the brilliant Africans, including Dasmus and Solar Freeze, and everyone who's been awarded today, is how do we build the capital formation to start having the conversation around wealth. That's what matters. My second name, which was the name I was given when I was baptized, is Michael. And for those of you who have any Christian background, do you remember that Michael was an angel, always going out to spread the word and say something, being sent? He was almost like the first superhero. Always there. When you're just at your lowest point, he was always there. We have to go out as ambassadors of Africa, spreading the word. We have to change the narrative. We have to own the narrative. There's a very interesting African proverb that says, until a lion has a historian, the story of the hunt will always favor the hunted, or the hunter rather. So the hunter will tell the story from his own perspective. We need to own the Africa story. We need to change the narrative. Ours is not a continent that is full of disease, poverty, war, strife, lack of institutions. But that's all that we hear, because that's all that the media feeds on. But whose responsibility is it to change the narrative? Sometimes it takes just one person doing and standing for what is right. Each of us building an oasis of sanity in that circle of influence that we have. We need to start telling the Africa story differently. We all seated here are ambassadors of Africa. Maybe not political ambassadors, but certainly what we do and say matters. I had the opportunity of doing an MBA in China, just out of curiosity. This was before the virus. I mean, I'm talking 2017, so some people I shook hands with some people. Don't go start washing your hands. And some of the school trips we had, we went to villages. I happened to be the first black person that some of those people have seen. And I knew I represented not just myself, I represented a people. As Africans, we matter. The things we say matter. The things we do matter. And we must always remember that when we engage with the rest of the world. We must tell a different African story. But the mistake we shouldn't make is to be focused on just telling a story. It must be backed up by what we do. So I'm extremely proud looking at young Africans sitting in a setting like this. You guys are already winners. This is what some people dream of and might never attain. And the fact that you're here and you have a voice today, make it count. And make it count for something that is meaningful. My third name, and this is very traditional, and I'll pronounce it as it's spelled, is Nsukka. Sounds like Kunta Kinte, something really dramatic. And what Nsukka means is an architect, a pathfinder, a creator. And I think it embodies the African spirit of innovation. For us to win as Africans, we need to not just solve today's problems, but we need to start thinking about the innovative ways we can solve today's problems without jeopardizing the future of tomorrow. We must think out of the box. We must dare to do things differently. Thomas Sankara was the one who said that Africans must dare to dream. Growing up as a child, I remember something we used to watch called Space 1999. I'm not sure a lot of people will be in that age group. But what was interesting about Space 1999 was that they used to talk to themselves over a screen. And today we do FaceTime. That's the power of a dream. We must dare to dream. Within my bank and my institution, what we say is that the tomorrow that you want, if you want to own it, create it yourself today. We must energize the likes of Solar Freeze and many Africans who are innovative and are looking for an outlet to win. Now, the challenge around innovation is if you're in a society where the conversation is not built around merit, trying to innovate means nothing. Because it's not about who is best at it. It's about who knows who. The Africa of tomorrow to win has to be one that is, the conversation is around merit. It's around who brings the best to the table such that we can win. My fourth name is Nkema Kolam. Very heavy to pronounce, given to me by my grandmother. And literally it means, this one that is mine should not go bad. This one that is mine should not cause me pain. The wealth that we have in Africa has triggered so much wars and strife. We fight for diamond. We fight for oil. And it divides us as against bringing us together. For Africa to win in the future, it has to be built around sustainability. It's not about what we have today. It's about how we can use the little that we have to ensure that even the poorest amongst us have a voice and are proud of who they are and what they represent. It has to be an Africa that is built on inclusiveness, on ensuring that everybody's voice is heard. We have to focus on the environment. It's not enough to plunder today and bequeath to the next generation an environment that is not conducive enough for them to live and strive and look forward to the future. We have to look at women, children, the most vulnerable amongst us, and bring them into the conversation. It's not enough to pay lip service to supporting women and making it more inclusive. We must create a platform that allows women strive, not just in the workplace, but even at home. We have to build governance and institutions and try and break away from that Messiah syndrome that a lot of African nations have. This is the guy who's come to save us. The Messiah syndrome in itself builds despots and dictators, and they turn around and bite us. But we created those monsters. We have to build around sustainability, the environment. For businesses, it's beyond profit. It has to be about the people they serve, the communities they engage in, and ensuring that the planet stays today as well as tomorrow. My family name or my surname is Ogbonna, which translated means father's friend, a bosom, someone you really cherish. Now, everyone has a friend. I think the beauty of a friend is that they're there for you at your highs and lows. You go through life with them, go through pain and joy. But the greatest friends are the ones who can tell you the truth to your face, make you understand the places where you've gone wrong, and get you to retrace your steps. For Africa to work in the future, we need to be able to tell truth to power. And we must build institutions that allow it to work, and you're not afraid to participate. A lot of us might never get into politics because, as we say, it's too dirty. But as long as we stand by the sideline and watch others determine the future of Africa, or our nation specifically, and never get involved, then we have no say. And the worst of us, we lead the best of us. And there's no gainsaying as to exactly where we will end up. There must be peer review across Africa. We must build a system where nations can hold each other accountable for the things they do and how they do it. I think it was Kwame Nkrumah who says that you're not just African because you were born in the continent and carry an African passport. You're African because the African blood flows in your veins. So I don't care where you are, where you were born. If you're African, you will know. The blood is there. And we must stand together to support Africa to grow. Several African countries, when a Caucasian comes to set up a business, he can do it in 2 minutes. If a fellow African comes to set up a business, it takes him 3 years. Because as Africans, we find it difficult to work together. That has to change for Africa to grow. We must be trade partners. We must draw energies. We must think about the Pan-Africanists, the likes of Nyerere, Mandela, the likes of Nnamdi Azikiwe, and all of those guys who try to build an inclusive Africa where we pool our resources, pool our energies together to build a continent for the betterment of the people. I don't care how far you try to run or hide or deny the blood that flows through your vein. You need to understand something. As Africans, our self-worth is built on the self-worth of the community that we come from. So I can run as far as I want to. Each time an African is being judged, for good or for bad, whether you like it or not, it rubs off on you some way. So I'm Nigerian. And the first thing you hear when you go to many markets to do business is that someone says, "Are you a 419?" There are less than 5% of Nigerians, what do I mean 5%? Less than 100,000 Nigerians who have colored the rest of the community with the 419 toga. And it's very hard to shake away. So we must remember to work together, to build partnerships across Africa. I've shared with you the 5 critical ingredients as I see it necessary to support Africa as we go into the future. The first I shared with you is the conversation around wealth. Let's move away from abundance and the natural resources that we have and start having a conversation around building wealth for Africa. Let's change the narrative. A lot of people ask me at the release of Black Panther whether Wakanda was a real nation. And I'm sure you know what my answer was. Yeah? My answer was yes. Because Africa truly can be that. And we must be proud of that story. It was Chimamanda Adichie who says that if you tell the people one thing over and over and over again, just that one thing, after a while they become that. So let's change the narrative. Let's tell ourselves that one thing, and let it be that Africans are great in themselves. And that collective spirit will be the force that we require to change our continent. The third thing I spoke about was around building innovation and having a society that's built around merit. And having that conversation that forces talent and youth, the likes of Solo Freeze, to come to the center stage and have a voice. Let's build sustainability. Let's think about the most vulnerable amongst us, because they matter too. Let's give them a platform to have a voice. And let's build partnerships. Because Africa's problems cannot be fixed by anybody else but Africans themselves. So we must come together, work collectively to build that partnerships. I work for an institution called Access Bank. Access Bank is the fastest growing bank in Africa over the last 18 years. It also happens to be the largest African bank within our own markets. What has made Access Bank interesting, or an interesting place to work, is that these are the conversations we have every day. Every day we seek to make an impact on women, working with the World Bank and IFC to build a sustainable environment for women businesses to thrive. And for that, we have our W initiative, supporting women new in business and are looking for finance to grow. We have conversations around society and the impact on climate. We happen to be the only African bank that signed up to the global initiative around sustainable banking at the last World Bank conference in DC. We're working with Global Initiative to tell a different story about Nigeria. We're working with the Ford Foundation to look at Africa differently and positioning Africa in such a manner that we begin to see it in the new light that it is. There's a lot of music in Africa. In Nigeria alone, there are 774 different tribes and languages. That's a rich culture, but nobody tells that story. There's fashion. There's music. We need to retell the African story. Working with the likes of Ford Foundation and Global Citizen, Access Bank is helping to tell that story. I've been in the bank for 18 years, and the reason I get excited every day I come to work is that opportunity to be able to make impact, not just in the lives of the people who work with us, but the communities and the markets that we serve. As I close, I urge you to think about these 5 critical things: how they impact you as an individual, the markets that you operate in, and I think more importantly, what you can do to further this conversation. It doesn't stop here. Let me take the opportunity to thank Chinedu, Zainab, and the rest of their team for an excellent conference that they've put together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roosevelt, for an amazing keynote. So actually, I realized that we forgot to introduce Roosevelt before he gave his speech. So I'll do a brief introduction now. Maybe it's better late than never. Roosevelt Ogbonna is the Deputy Managing Director and CEO of Access Bank, PLC, one of Nigeria's leading banking institutions, serving over 44 million individual and corporate account holders through over 600 branches and more than 3,000 ATMs in major centers across Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the UK. He has over 20 years of experience in banking, cutting across treasury, commercial, corporate, and investment banking. Prior to his appointment as Deputy Group MD, he was the Executive Director of the Wholesale Banking Division of Access Bank. He's a Fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria, a Senior Executive of Harvard Kennedy School, and a CFA charter holder. He holds a Master's degree in Business Administration from IMD Business School, an Executive Master's degree in Business Administration from Cheung Graduate School of Business, and a Bachelor's degree in Banking and Finance from the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. In 2015, he was selected as one of the Institute of International Finance, IIF, Future Global Leaders. Please join me in re-welcoming Roosevelt Ogbonna.
So thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you for that discussion. I think, one of the things that was even missing from the introduction was the road traveled so far by Access Bank, right? 2002, you start, 65th largest bank in Nigeria, today, the largest bank in Africa. And I think that journey is remarkable, and it's, clearly evidences that you walk the talk that you laid out for us. One of the things that, we wanted to talk about first is around this idea of partnerships. 2019 was the banner year for intra-African trade conversations. We signed the free trade agreement, the ratification processes are going. As we think about rolling that out, what are the changes to enabling institutions or cultures required to actually achieve the dream of intra-African trade?
So I think firstly, we've gotten the political war won, which is to get political leaders across Africa to see the benefit of breaking down the boundaries. I remember many years ago, I was reading some magazine called the African Magazine, or African, I can't remember, and it spoke about how the boundaries across Africa really did not exist in the 50s and 60s. So you could be Nigerian and you worked in Ghana, and you worked in Liberia, and there was free movement of not just humans, but as well goods and services. And it meant that there was more trade between African countries than there were with us and the West. That has changed significantly because everyone seems to have brought the borders much higher than they used to be. And in some sense, more suspect as to who the other African country is. So yes, the political war has been won, which is, let's do more trade together. Now, it comes to the nuts and the bolts. How do we get Africa businesses to begin to speak and talk together? Now, for trade to work, finance has to be involved. We don't have any large, significant African bank that was involved in the trade space. So we either had to deal with Ghana. You have to go all the way to London through a correspondent bank, and then from London you come back to Ghana. And Ghana is, 2 or 3 hours away from Nigeria. That has to change. The trade platforms and trade corridors have to change to facilitate trade. One of the things we're doing as Access Bank is that we're building what we refer to as the gateway to Africa. So this supports intra-Africa trade, but I think more importantly, it supports intra-Africa trade. So we've built what today is the largest African bank in London and the most profitable. And that's again speaking to a European bank to get business done in Africa. You're dealing with Access Bank. We've set up a bank in Dubai in recognition of the fact that trade is moving east. And this ensures that as Africans, if you're doing business and you have to go to China or any of those places, you have an anchor. We're going to Hong Kong. We're present in China today. And the idea is, firstly, get the financing structure right. There are many African countries today that are cut off from the rest of the world for no other reason but the fact that the correspondent banks say it's too expensive from a risk management perspective to operate in your country. And that cuts them off from the rest of the world. Now, as they leave, African banks have to take up that role. And that's what Access Bank is doing. So connecting Africa is important to support trade. Now, if you have a business in Nigeria that has products to sell to Ghana, that conversation only happens if there can be trust built on both sides. So trust beyond finance is a critical ingredient to get businesses to speak to each other. The banks can play a role in that, because I bank you in Ghana, it might be Access Ghana, or Access Kenya, or Access Rwanda, and then there's Access Nigeria. Having those trade conversations happen. Today, we working with the German government, we have something called the German desk. And all the German desk does is to facilitate trade between Nigeria and Germany. And the real role of the desk is to build trust. So we bring the German business, we bring the Nigerian business, and we act as the facilitator to make that conversation happen. So get the politics right, I think we've ticked that box. Get the financing structure right, I think we will tick the box, because there are many African banks that are trying to play that role today, Access Bank being one of them. I think the last thing is building trust. And with trust is around ensuring that the quality is right. So if you say this is what I've supplied, then it better be. And creating the instruments to make sure that happens. And I think that is where the work must continue to happen.
Makes sense. And as we think about this as well, I think, many have looked to technology and financial technology specifically as a vehicle to help bridge some of these divides that are, keeping trade from being what it is. As you look at the financial technology landscape, whether it be payments, infrastructure, or now lending and savings products that exist technologically, do you view that as a complement to what you're doing? Do you view it as a competitor to what you're doing? And do you feel like the regulatory infrastructure is where it needs to be for technology to really play its role?
So our view in the bank is that we see them as partners. So if you take Nigeria, for example, we're 200 million people. About 50 or 60 unique banking accounts is what we have. The rest of the country is unbanked or underbanked. And the reality is that for so many institutions, it doesn't make economic sense to do traditional banking in several of those locations. Now, you can't do it on your own, so you partner with the fintechs because they bring a platform that solves two problems: speed to market, cost to serve. And those two issues are real. So now you can penetrate markets that would have taken you 6 to 12 months to do because you needed to build a physical branch. Leveraging technology, working with the fintechs, you could do that in a day. So the conversation is changing across Africa. We don't see them as competition. I guess that in some sense might be naive because they're eating your lunch and they're coming for exactly the same things that you want. But our view is that we can grow the pie. And it's a blue ocean view, which is today it's 50. It could be 200 million. And why don't we have the conversation around how we bring the rest of the unbanked population into the formal system of banking? From a regulatory perspective, I think the regulators are playing catch up, but they're doing so very quickly. I think it doesn't help that several banks belly ache as to the kind of things the fintechs can do that we can't. But the reality is that arbitrage will close up very quickly. So for us, invest in technology, and we have three perspectives. Is either we buy them because it makes sense to, we partner with them, or we build our own. And we found out that it's much easier to just partner and build a larger cake for everyone to participate in.
Makes sense. And as you think about particularly this technology issue, and one of the things that we've been talking about across a number of panels is the issues of talent that make it difficult to execute on what the strategy would seemingly ask you to do. How does Access Bank focus on that issue of talent, particularly global talent, maybe not in the markets in which you currently operate?
Well, so talent is always going to be the issue. I mean, particularly for the kind of business we do, which is a service business. There's a lot of brain drain. It doesn't help that several Canadian companies come into Nigeria and offer Canadian passports, citizenship, a job, paying $150,000 to $200,000. We've lost a lot of IT people who have just, it's too good to be true, and they've left. But I think with 65% of our population below 35, that's a huge population that we can harness. And there's talent in there. It's about what you put your minds to. In the bank today, we've set up something called the African Fintech Foundry. And it's our own way of trying to help promote the fintech space and young talents who are looking to express themselves leveraging technology. We've had about 7 or 8 hackathons. We've had 2 digital disrupt conferences, which is just around sharing ideas, building an accelerator program to help these talents and the ideas blossom. And it's been amazing, to be honest. So there's not a dearth of talent. It's about finding a platform that makes them comfortable enough to want to express themselves. And there's many institutions that can do that to support them. I think there's enough in Africa, not just to satisfy our needs internally, to actually export to the rest of the world.
You know, another topic that was, really on the minds of many here is, one of the hottest themes that we've heard in recent years is this idea of financial inclusion. And each person saying it seems to have their own definition of what it means to be financially inclusive or have financially inclusive products. How do you define this? And what steps are you taking to build a business that seeks to achieve that definition of inclusion?
All right, so I guess the easiest way to look at it is for several Africans who have been cut off from the financial system. Not only don't they have an access to raising funds if they have projects, they cannot formalize their transactions. And so if they ever needed to leverage, it becomes increasingly difficult because there's really no track, no history, no data, nothing about them. They're almost like a ghost in today's time. The conversation around bringing the poorest amongst us up will require that you formalize the kind of transaction and relationships that they have. Now, within our bank, the way we've looked at it is it's not a profitable venture to get into, but it's one that has to be done. So we needed to think differently about how we do it. We've set up something called Access Closer. These are containerized branches. There are about 180 of them. About 40 have been rolled out. So it costs about 25% of the cost of doing a normal branch. And these branches are now being set up in villages, in small townships where there are no banks. We've set up an agency network. Today we have about 17,000 agents. And the idea is that these agents are known in those markets, in those small communities, and we're using them as a platform to be able to bring the unbanked into the banking system. Now, so getting them to sign up and open accounts is one thing, but I don't think that's where it ends. It's around allowing them get the bank verification number, which going forward will be critical for several things they need to do with government. So they now have an identity, and it's an identity that allows them to borrow if they needed to. We also, that platform that we've created also enables them to be able to deal and interact with themselves. Now, there's always a lack of trust between small banking communities and banks, and that's where the agency relationships come into play, because the agent is a local, has a business within that locality, and is able to build trust amongst the people that exist there. We recently just finished a merger in 2019 with a bank called Diamond Bank that invested significantly in building small businesses and small communities, leveraging technology. And that's something we're having to do a lot of learning. They have something called a Better program, and what the Better program was were small community agents that were going door to door to educate people around financial services, around financial planning, personal financial management, helping them save towards objectives that they've set for themselves, and making it easier for them to understand the language of finance. It's not very profitable, as I said, but I think from a social impact perspective, that's something we're extremely proud of, that we've continued post our acquisition and a merger with Diamond Bank, and we'll continue to pursue it as well.
And before I ask the final question, I'd just like to flag that we have microphones in the middle of the room, and people can start lining up to ask questions. But one of the questions, that's really been on, many people's mind is this idea of government being the elephant in the room. Very often, businesses are trying to find ways to innovate around government, because they feel like they can't have an impact on what's going on there from a policy perspective. As you get so large, oftentimes I imagine government starts becoming more and more relevant in your operations. How do you approach that idea of engagement with government, and how do you approach the idea of trying to get better policy outcomes to enable some of the stuff that you're trying to get done?
Well, I mean, across Africa, government is always going to be an issue. I mean, most African countries, government is 40% of economic activity, so they are significant. You can't, beyond just forming policies, they are also critical economic actors in most markets. Our view typically is that with governments, you follow them with a lot of discernment, particularly African governments. If you're too frontal and too open in your views, they might come at you. And so you have to partner with government, if there's such a word. I mean, so you're going to government with a policy thought or idea, but ultimately it's governments to execute. And I think all you can do working with government is to show them that beyond the words that you're offering, you're also going to put your balance sheet on the table to support the initiative. And many times they'll give you leave to do so because you're not asking government to participate in anything. You're just saying, we think this is a great idea. We want you to give us leave to put our balance sheet behind it and show you that it's workable. I think building that trust with government is extremely important. As you rightly said, I mean, for a bank our size, being the largest bank in our market today, we can't avoid having that conversation. So many times we've had to intervene for policy issues. It does help that today, either through the central bank or through several government institutions, before policies are issued, there are drafts which are circulated amongst the financial services system, and we're being asked to bring our input and our thoughts into it before those policies are eventually formulated. And I think we're trying to make an impact, but I'll be lying to you if I tell you that the impact we've made is significant up to today. But we just have to keep engaging. And I think that's the only way we can play it as private sector participants.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And at this point, I think we'll transition to questions from the audience.
So we only have about a few minutes left, so we're just going to take these 4 questions here. But if you don't mind, can you ask them 2 at a time, and then you can enter.
Thank you very much. My name is Joseph Luis. I'm from Liberia. My question is, well, firstly, there is this narrative in Africa that a lot of Africa's misfortune and problem is largely and squarely the problem of colonial ideas perpetuated into our system. So, and it is an idea held by a lot of Africans up to today's date that after 60 years of independence, these ideas still manifest themselves within our system, and as a result of that, Africa keeps going backwards. So my question to you is, how can Africa as a continent go ahead or forward when these colonial ideas are still present within our system? And the next aspect of that question also is, how, as a young African like myself, can be able to muster the courage to go against this idea and see myself contributing to the betterment of Africa, despite knowing that these colonial structures, they are still in place and they still impede growth and prosperity. Thank you very much.
Just take a second question as well.
Hi, my name is Joseph Tumwebaze. I'm from Penn State University. My question is about corruption. You've mentioned all these strategies and coming together, but corruption is a real problem that is affecting all this. And I feel like one of the reasons why mainly Africa is still a cash community is because people fear to make it cashless because of accountability and, being transparent about the transactions that are being carried out with governments. Then my second question is about, is it possible for banks to become intermediaries for people in the diaspora to be able to purchase land back home in Africa? Because that's a problem. Sometimes you want to buy land, but you have no contact, you have no reliable source, or even when you purchase the land and you go on ground, then they tell you, oh, you bought nothing, or the money was surrendered or something. Is it possible for banks to come in as intermediaries? Because I believe people can store their wills there and so many other things, so I believe they're trustable. So I feel like they'll help in that area. Thank you.
All right, so the first question that Joseph asked around the colonial structures and mentality, and so I guess the way to look at it is the fact that you're even speaking about it must tell you that, yeah, even if it did exist historically, once you know that there's a problem and you're speaking about the problem, then what stops you from solving it? So I will run away from passing the bulk and burden of making a choice to move forward on something that is historical. It's almost like believing that there's, so you ask a young man why he's not doing well. Say, no, there's a historical curse in my family. And, so it doesn't matter how well I strive, I will not come to much. Now, that's a man who doesn't want to take responsibility. So Africa must take responsibility. And to be honest, in several spheres within Africa, we're winning. Think about Kenya and M-Pesa. Is that not Africa? But it's pioneering. It's doing great things. It's doing new things. Think about MTN, the South African company, and how well it has grown and the boundaries it has broken. Even with this same colonial history, it's thriving. Think about the banking system within Africa. It's grown in leaps and bounds and doing things that banks in the West are not even dreaming of being able to do. But that's still Africa. That's a group of people who have chosen, even with that narrative, to win. So I think it's a choice. Now, as long as we keep perpetuating these ideas that the reason we don't win is because we have the colonials who have put a curse or created a structure that makes it impossible to win, then honestly, we will never win. So I think in our own small spheres, let's disabuse our minds of those things. I mean, we say to young talents when they join our bank, for instance, that one of the things we want to create is to make you a consummate professional. And the way to test it is that someday you stand in Wall Street and there'll be 4 bankers. Someone from JP Morgan, somebody from HSBC, somebody from whichever international bank you want to call. And no one is wearing a lapel or an ID card. And they say, tell us who works in an African bank. And you can't tell the difference because you go to the same schools. You have the same level of exposure. You have the right ingredient to make you win. And I sat in the classroom with these white colonial masters, as you call them. And we beat them in school, right? And you hear about Africans, I mean, I hate to use this example, but I think it's as real as you get. Africans are so unintelligent, but they are good at 419. I mean, who are they scamming? The stupid person? No, you need to get it right. The very stupid African is scamming the very, very intelligent colonial master. Can you see, when we want to take responsibility, we do. Now, when we don't, we will always have a reason why we're not succeeding. So, Joseph, let's disabuse our minds. There's no such thing. Let's win, because we have the right ingredients to do so. I think one of the things that stops us from winning is this idea around corruption. I think that's what the last question was around. And how can we ensure that the gains that we're having, corruption doesn't just keep eating it away. I think the only way to do so is to build institutions. Now, I talked about running away from having one African messiah. I mean, just look across Africa, post-independence. You had a lot of African leaders who got there, and the day they were sworn in, the people were celebrating and jubilating on the streets, welcoming them as the savior. And 20 years later, we're all praying, going to church and mosque, and begging God for them to just go. Now, that's what happens when you build countries around people. We have to build institutions, because institutions those are the things that sustain and ensure that we can fight corruption without having to carry guns and standing on the streets and having to ask you how much money you have in your pocket each time. So I think if we focus on building institutions, we will win. Corruption exists everywhere, to be honest. I mean, if I learned anything from the Kennedy School in the weeks I spent there, is how contracts in Iran or Iraq during the war were completely corrupt. Hospitals were built in, so maybe you go to a village, there are 200 people, you build a 400-bed hospital. For who? But this happens. It happens in the US, right? So every country has an element of corruption, but I think what makes it work in more markets than none, than ours, is that they've built institutions, and those institutions hold the leaders accountable. The question around land and financial intermediation, I think we can have a meeting afterwards and let's see if we can build a business model around that. But thank you.
Yes, over there.
Hi. My name is Yao Owusu-Boahen from Ghana, co-founder and CEO of Lemons. So my company does a lot of thinking about human capital and what it actually looks like to do equitable hiring for people and not relying on things like resumes and all of that. So we talked a little bit about how there's this great human capital in Africa that so much of the population is young and they're also hungry and they're doing these great ventures. But you talked a little bit about institutions as well and how it's not just about people, but creating the right institutions for them to thrive. At Access Bank and with the clients that you work with, how do you approach the problem of seeing a person and actually being able to tell, like, is this someone I want to work in my organization? Is this person going to push my company forward? And how do you figure that out at scale to make sure that all of this human capital of young people actually become plugged into the right places to help achieve the needs that you mentioned? Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question.
Mr. Roosevelt Ogbonna, you make me very proud to be African.
Thank you.
One thing I note from your presentation is you are historically aware. You talk of the Nkrumahs. You talk about the Azikiwes. And that archetype is what I see in Access Bank. It is evident in your programming. And one of the things I'm curious about, you talked about the issue with capital formation, that being a huge need. We are at a unique time in history, the middle of the United Nations International Decade for people of African descent, who represent 200 million people globally, not counting the African continent. We saw a signal with Ghana's Year of Return last year, an unprecedented influx of diaspora dollars in the vicinity of 1.9 billion, I mean, give or take. So it shows that there is potential there. And I don't see a deliberate policy or strategy.
Sorry, sir. Can you ask your question, please? Sorry.
I'm getting there.
Oh, okay.
And it's a very important point, please.
All
right?
Okay.
I don't see a deliberate plan or strategy from Access Bank to tap into this market of 200 billion globally. When you say you're not African because you were born in Africa, but because Africa has been born in you, that is a marketing statement, and it reaches millions around the world. So how does Access Bank move further into tapping into this market of 200 million, which hasn't been tapped at all?
Thank you. So I'll start with Yao's question around talent and building it for scale. I think clearly one of the advantages we have in Africa is people, as we've said. It's 1.6 billion, 65% young adults. However, not all that talent is skilled, and it's skilled for the Africa of the future that we all envisage. So there's a lot of training that needs to happen. So we have a lot of structural unemployment in Africa, not because the people are not there, but because they are not skilled enough for what it is that we're doing going into the future. In our own little way, I think we can't solve all of Africa's problem as Access Bank, but we've created an oasis of sanity that ensures Mozambicans are joining the Access Bank train to ensure that we build a new wave of Mozambicans that are trained and ready to attack the market Kenyans are going through the same thing. Cameroonians are going through the same thing. Nigerians, of course, Ghanaians. Across all our African network, we're building one Access Bank person. In Access Bank, you're not Nigerian or Ghanaian or British or from the Emirates. You're just an Access Bank staff. And it means that you can work anywhere across the globe. Now, for that to happen, the quality of that talent has to equate or equalize in some sense. So we have a mini MBA, a 5-month mini MBA that you must go through when you join the institution. Another name Access Bank is known for in the market is Bank of University Excellence. So you never stop learning in Access Bank. And this is something that is led by leadership. So I'm right now, I'm the Group Deputy Managing Director of the bank, overseeing 29,000 people who report to me. But I'm in school. I've gone back to read law. And I'm doing my master's in law. And that's what we encourage all our people to do, and the institution pays for it. So as long as you hunger and quest for knowledge and excellence, Access Bank is creating that platform for you to self-actualize. And that's what we're building. So we might not solve all of Africa's problem from a talent perspective, but I think we're building a platform that brings all Africans together on one platform and allow them to be the best that they can actually aspire to be. So you're only limited by your own dreams within the Access Bank system. And we have to continue that conversation. As we expand to more African countries, we will bring that conversation and that platform to those markets to make it work. The last question, which was around tapping into the diaspora flow and all of that. I'm not sure we've done enough, and I'll be honest in raising my hands to say so. But I think we've started that conversation. There's something we have, a platform called Access Africa. And what Access Africa does today is that across 19 markets, including China, Europe, and the US, if you're African, you can get onto that. You don't have to have an Access Bank account. You can get onto that platform and you can wire and transfer money person to person, person to business, and it's happening today. Now, so it's still a one-sided conversation because it's just a platform that allows you to transfer money. But I think what you're saying is that we have to take it further and bring the conversation where we harness that wealth that exists externally and use that to support Africa as it grows, either from a capital formation perspective. I mean, we have a lot of bright and young Africans who are working in PE firms or working in institutions that are focused on capital building in Africa. And maybe working with them, we can create a platform that allows young or Africans across the globe to be able to use that as channels or platforms to be able to then invest in infrastructure in Africa. So that's something we could look at. We had a meeting with the World Bank 2 weeks ago. And the idea was, knowing this capital deficit that exists, what is it we can do to fast-track that capital formation? And we had thought about something that turned out to be controversial, which was, can we use the pension funds to invest in capital building, which is what they were meant to do anyway, because they're long money. And long money is what is required to make that investment. But you can imagine it's become very touchy and very political and all of that. So maybe the thought that you have might be another way to achieve the same objective without ruffling feathers. So something we'll take on. Thank you.
Perfect.
Please give our keynote another round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. Well, maybe you should hold it. All right. Thank you.